Join occupational therapist and key creative coach Taylor Riffel as she shares her personal experiences growing up with OCD, or Obsessive Compulsive Disorder. Taylor is passionate about mental health and helping families discover all they are capable of. This episode contains references to self-harm and suicidal ideation. Stay tuned. It's time for Key Talks. Welcome back, our viewers, our listeners, our Key Talks family, to another episode of Key Talks. If you're joining us for the very first time, or maybe for the 6th or 7th time, my name is Deanna Halls, and I'm Key Creative's Communications Director. I'm also a co-host with my colleague across the table from me, Paula Audrey Rivero, Key Creative's Chief Operations Officer.
I'm doing something different today. I usually do the jazz hands. But anyway.
Now the pressure's on me for me to do something different.
Yeah, and so Paula, would you like to introduce our topic and our guest today?
Oh, yes. Okay, so I feel like I'm always excited for all of our episodes, but I'm really looking forward to this conversation today with a colleague of ours, Taylor Riffel, who is going to be sharing about her own personal experience with mental health and specifically with OCD, which she'll define and explain and elaborate on, and how she uses her own mental health, whether it's challenges, but also ways that she's been able to incorporate that whole aspect into her life in a meaningful way with her clients here at Key Creative. So she's an occupational therapist on our team, and we're super grateful to have her here today. And we'll welcome her out from the green room and get the talking started.
Welcome.
Nice
right.
and cozy.
Hello.
It's kind of cozy. These chairs are cozy enough. Hopefully.
Yeah,
I'm a little more laid back today for this conversation.
Yeah.
I have my booties on instead of my can I say Fluevog? My Fluevog shoes, fancy Fluevogs. And I love your toque,
guys. Yeah. Thank you. I know you're a big supporter of this toque, so that's why I wore it today.
Be kind to your mind.
Yes,
I love it.
Yes, my motto. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Enjoy any opportunity. I was saying to Deanna and Micah ahead of time, just any opportunity to talk about mental health. I think it's important to raise awareness and talk about how it's kind of made me a better professional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think something that, I think you're extremely wonderful and awesome. And I'm grateful for you. And one of the things that you'll notice about Taylor is her authenticity. Whether you're here working at Key or in your outside world with your community, you're sharing that same message about mental health matters. And I love that we all have little characters called Oosh, which is an owl, and we get to, decide what we want them to represent. And mine, for example, is Oosh, the owl, sharing, receiving, giving love. So it's the owl dressed in pink with a bunch of hearts. And yours is an Oosh holding a sign that says mental health matters.
Yeah.
So maybe as I'm saying that, what makes mental health matter so much to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what I'll start, just for the listeners, is explaining a little bit about OCD,
Yes.
because a lot of this ties to my journey and why mental health does matter to me so much.
Yes.
So OCD stands for Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, and it basically is characterized by somebody who experiences unwanted thoughts, also called obsessions, that causes them lots of anxiety. In order to cope with this anxiety, they'll engage in repetitive behaviors or mental acts, which we call compulsions. So that's where the obsessions and compulsions come from. Example that commonly you'll hear is somebody who's scared of germs or has a fear of germs. They will engage in a lot of repetitive hand washing. So in that case, the obsession would be the thoughts of what if I get contaminated, or the fear of germs, and the compulsion would be the repetitive hand washing. But what I also want to kind of I think it's really important for me to or the most important thing I think that I want to leave listeners with for this episode is that OCD is a lot more than this idea of repetitive behaviors or lining things up or liking things clean. I think that's commonly what we see in society, but there's this whole side of OCD that's just so less understood and less seen. In the community, they'll call it peer O or peer OCD. And basically, it's more based on obsessions, so these thoughts and fears, and then the compulsions are mental rituals or mental things that you can't see outwardly. So the example I'll give is like somebody might have a fear of harming others, and they have a very, 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 very small chance of actually engaging in this, but they are so consumed by this fear of what if I were to harm somebody?
And this fear, and is it like this thought?
Yes, this thought. It gets stuck on a loop. It's called an intrusive thought.
Yes.
And so they'll engage in compulsions like avoiding sharp objects or avoiding situations where they could be in a situation where they could potentially harm someone because they're so scared of what if I were to do that. And we all have intrusive thoughts. Like that's not common, or that's not, just specific to
Uncommon.
OCD.
Yeah.
Like we all have these thoughts. Like if you're driving in your car, a common one would be like, what if I were to swerve off the road, right? Like that's just a random thought that a lot of us have had. And somebody without OCD can have that thought go, well, that was weird, and then carry on with their day.
Yes.
Someone with OCD, they get stuck into a loop of why did I have that thought? What does that thought mean? Does that thought mean I'm a bad person? Does that thought mean I actually like want to die and go off the right? Like, so we get stuck in this like loop.
So like, is it like almost like you're almost making it more amplified? Like you're amplifying the thought to become more than just a thought. It's like now this story's being created around it.
Yeah.
This is fascinating to me because I don't think I understood it in that way. I mean, and then I'm even just thinking of myself and like my own thoughts. And like, so anyway, thank you for sharing. Sorry, I kind of cut you off.
And OCD does this really sneaky thing where it will kind of target something that you love most in the world. So in my journey, which I'll discuss like throughout this podcast, I did experience harm OCD, and a lot of it was around when I was living with my parents, and I was terrified of what if I were to hurt my parents? Because at that time, and still to this day, like my parents are some of the most important people in my life.
Yeah.
And so OCD will try to find something that is the most important thing to you, because it knows that that's how it gets stuck. Like that's how it can kind of stay around and play like a broken record in your brain.
Yeah.
So a lot of women who have postpartum OCD will have the fear of what if I hurt my baby? What if I drop my baby? What if I don't love my baby? And they'll get stuck in these mental loops, and it's really hard to kind of be pulled out of it. And that's where I want to kind of like focus a little bit about OCD is this idea that I too had the lining up and cleaning and organized. Like if you see my house, it's beautifully clean, but that's not distressing to me. I actually just like clean things and things organized, and maybe that's part of my OCD. But the distressing part and the hard part has been these intrusive thoughts that have been kind of like littered throughout my entire life.
Yeah. Because I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but mental health doesn't have to be a bad thing, but it's a thing that needs to be looked at when it's starting to be detrimental to your health.
Yeah.
Right. And if it's starting to be detrimental to your health, then you want to look at how you can help it.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So just sort of normalizing in one way that just because you want your house clean doesn't mean you need to label you can't, doesn't really matter. You have OCD. But I think the importance of it is to understand that when it's starting to be harmful, like how do we create space to support people in that situation without being afraid?
Yeah. And I think like that's a big thing too that I've when I first started to like go through this journey of discovering more about mental health and my own mental illness, that's kind of like a lot of what I heard is like people saying, well, everyone has anxiety or everyone has depression. And I'm like, nope, like people can have low days. Like we all have low days. People can be super anxious and have and be anxious about certain situations, but it's when it becomes something that impacts your life. And I think from that OT lens that I have is like when it actually impacts functioning, that's when we actually have to step back and be like, is this a disorder? And do we need some extra supports for it?
Could you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by functioning, like when
Yeah.
it how it impacts your functioning? Like, what do you mean by that? Maybe more specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. Like functioning from the OT lens is very much broken down into, does it impact your daily activities?
Mhm.
So like, are you able to get enough sleep? Are you able to get out of bed and start your day and go to work? And then there's this other side is, does it impact your social relationships? So are you like constantly avoiding social situations because you have this severe anxiety about being around people? Or are you avoiding like leisure activities because you're scared of leaving the house? Like that's when it's impacting your actual day-to-day functioning. So those are kind of those two areas that we look at, especially from that OT lens.
Thank you for sharing that. That helps
Yeah.
make sense of that
Yeah.
a little bit more. Do you want when did OCD present itself to you, I suppose?
Yeah.
When did that
it's-
come about for you?
I was thinking about this on my drive, and I was kind of like laughing because like my drive here, that my earliest memories have been like OCD memories. And funnily enough, like I met up with or I ran into my auntie from my day home that when I was really little, like early, my parents had to work quite early. And so she like basically helped raise me for many, many, many years. And she was telling me that she loved having me at the day home because I'd get off the preschool bus and I'd run in and I'd line up everybody's shoes and I'd go downstairs and quickly clean up the playroom before all the other kids came in. I'm like, what preschooler does that? I'm like, I know you have kids, so I know you know that that's not a common. But I'm like, no, we got to line everything up before everyone can get in and get moving. But also, like, again, that side is that it wasn't just the lining and cleaning up like that I was being faced with. Like, for example, when I was in school age, I would have this ritual that I had to do every night where I would sit in my bed and look around my room for 2 hours. I would watch the clock, and it had to be 2 hours.
How old, Taylor, were you?
I must have been probably grade 3, I would guess.
Okay, so grade 3, you're like 9 or
Yeah.
10
Yeah.
years old.
Yeah, so about then,
Yeah.
and I had to do it, and then after the 2 hours, I could go to bed after I said a 1 to 2 hour prayer for everybody I could ever think of. So like I look back and I'd be like, oh, I hope the firefighters are safe, and like, oh, my family's safe, and I'd have to list out everyone's name and make sure, because I felt if I didn't do this ritual, someone was going to die and it was going to be my fault.
Wow.
And obviously that's not rational and it's not logical. But OCD never is. And I think that sometimes what people will try to like reason with people with OCD, like they'll say like, oh, there's no way you would harm somebody, right? They're like, that's not your character. But it doesn't matter to somebody with OCD because it feels real and it feels intense and scary. And so kind of as I got older, go ahead.
Is it okay? Sorry, because
Yeah.
I just want to expand on that maybe a little bit. Like, it doesn't have to be that it's your character. There's just your brain is doing something else, right?
Yes.
That's kind of like challenging you, or maybe not, but like that is impacting who you are, but that doesn't make you good or bad.
Exactly.
Right? So I like how you're kind of making it or describing that it's not, you don't have to, it doesn't have to say anything bad about your character if you're having this type of experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know if there's value in me saying that, but I just feel for myself, even just feeling like just because I have these thoughts doesn't mean my character needs to be, defined as good or bad necessarily.
I totally know what you're saying there, because I think like looking back at my journey, like in therapy, one of the biggest realizations that helped me kind of like get to the point where I'm at now is this idea that we're not our thoughts and we are not our feelings.
Yes.
Like we're these human beings that are experiencing these things, but just because I have a thought doesn't mean I am that thought, or that just because I feel something doesn't mean like that's me.
Yes. Thank you. That is much more eloquent.
But
of my intention. Yes.
Yeah.
And you were the one who had mentioned to me like the untethered soul.
Yeah.
And that's sort of an aspect of that book about being a witness to what's going on in your mind so that you don't have to be your thoughts. You can be someone who's watching.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that
An
kind of
observer. That's
an
the
observer, exactly. And I think that that was another thing in therapy that I kind of helped me was externalizing myself from my mental illness. So a lot of me growing up, OCD was me, and I was OCD. Like, I didn't understand the difference. And so that's why, looking back, I'm like, a lot of my memories were very OCD based memories. It wasn't until I hit university and started going to therapy and working on this that I worked on this externalizing it. And I think, like, and what I mean by externalizing is like my OCD is a separate thing from my identity and who I am. And so this helps because now when an OCD thought does come up, I'm able to like label it as that's just my OCD, like creeping in. That's not me at my core. That's just a part of me that tries to poke its head every now and again. So I think that that's also helped, is that externalizing it. And something that I try to work with families too is like, a lot of these kids have diagnosis and they're at this age where they're forming the identities of like, who am I? And like, they become so intertwined with this like diagnosis that I like to like do activities where I'm like, what would OCD look like? Like, if it lived in your head and it was a creature, like, what would it look like? Or your anxiety, like, we'll make like little puppets of like, what's my anxiety look like? And I think it's because it really helps for kids to realize like, yes, my anxiety is there, but I am not my anxiety. Like, that's not the core of who I am.
Thanks for sharing that. It makes me think also about My Name is Trauma.
Yeah.
And using the tiger to externalize those experiences or the impact that trauma can have on the body. And not that my name, like, not that our trauma, the tiger, there's been many people before us who have used that analogy. And it's so important to do because it's so easy for people to start identifying themselves in a certain way. And then you can kind of spiral down into this place of negativity and start to lose confidence in yourself because of these stories that we're telling ourselves because of something we see as bad.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So I wanted to jump back to like what nine or 10 how OCD first sort of you said first when you were younger, going to preschool, line up the shoes, cleaning up the space, and then a little bit later in your bed before going to sleep, you'd spend 2 hours going through this thing. When did it maybe be like, when did you know, or was it ever identified to you, or did you ever feel like maybe this is what's going on for me?
I think like during the time, like, because this would have been like 20 years ago, right? During the time, mental health just wasn't really talked about. And I never blame my parents and stuff for like not seeing it because they didn't know any different. But there was this period in junior high. And we used to call it my phases that I would go through.
Okay.
And because we didn't know how to describe it any way else. And the thing about me is like, I was always kind of like a little bit quirky. Like, I have this quirky side, but I'm also like athletic. So I've been a part of like a lot of teams. I have like a lot of friends. I'm like, I like to do all these activities. So from the outside, you wouldn't think I was struggling with anything.
Yeah.
I think only like my family and maybe like some close friends would be like, something's a little bit off here, but like, we don't know like how to like label it. Right. But in junior high, this was a time when like social media was starting to become like a big thing, right? Like Facebook was like coming out, and people were on MSN and Nexopia and all of these different websites. And I started to develop what's like paranoid OCD. I don't know if that's actually the branch of OCD, but I developed this fear of somebody coming and kidnapping me, like finding me and kidnapping me. And it became such an intense fear that I would spend hours and hours and hours on the internet just looking at any website I could have maybe been on, anything I'd been on in the past to see if I had any identifying information. Like, I think I just had watched an episode of like Oprah Winfrey show and like seen something about a kid being kidnapped and was like, I have to make sure that does not happen to me.
Wow.
And I got to a point where like my mom actually had me call like my friend's dad, who's a cop, to have him explain to me like, your chances of being kidnapped like are not high. Like you're fine. But again, you can't rationalize with OCD, right? And so I remember my mom at one point was like, "Do you want to see like the school counselor? Like you're obviously struggling with something." And at that moment, I was like, "No, like absolutely not." Like there was just so much stigma to mental health that even the thought of talking to the school counselor was just like that was just not going to be in the books for me at that time. And then coming through high school, I got really good at masking it. I got wildly good grades, and a lot of my OCD kind of was, I think, focused on school. Like, and I'm talking like when I was in grade 10, I got 100%. Like I ended up with 100% in science at the end of the year. Like, and they had like that, they're like, this is unheard of. But because I could just channel my OCD and like, okay, if I'm going to obsess about something, I'm going to obsess about school and get real good at doing school. But then after high school, it all kind of crashed down on me when I went on to university. And keeping in mind at this time, we didn't know what was going on with me. I didn't know I had a diagnosis. I thought everybody had what I was or experiencing what I was experiencing, but they were just better at dealing with it. Is like kind of how I would word it. Is I was like, everyone has these thoughts, but they're just like how have I not cracked the code of like how to like calm myself down and not worry about things that people are telling me I don't need to worry about.
And then do you start to feel like something's wrong with you?
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of something I still work on with my therapist is this idea that like I'm not weird. Like and even like the idea that weird, I say this to my clients all the time, like weird's not a bad thing. We're all weird. We all have our little like quirks and stuff. But I think growing up that long without a diagnosis for 20 plus years, I did get this internal like identity of being the weirdo or being strange and like, but very much internally.
Yes.
I was good at hiding it.
So it's not that it was coming from but yourself.
Yes. Yeah, it was very much like, I'm weird, but like I can't let other people know that I'm weird. And then come university.
What were you afraid of? What was the fear of other people? No, I'm from your perspective.
Question. I think a lot of it would have been because I had this identity of having friends, being athletic, being funny. Like I had this like identity that I was trying to develop, or maybe like growing into. I don't know how to kind of word that, but that OCD seemed like this thing that I just didn't want. Like, and so then I would kind of almost just be like ashamed of it.
Like, can I lean? Yes. Like what you mentioned, masking in high school, right? So, I don't do. Would you like to explain what masking is?
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. Masking and please add in if like I'm missing something from it. But masking, and I know it's a term that's often used with autism spectrum disorder as well, is that kids don't look like they have autism from the outside, but internally, like they will be going through like needing things lined up and dysregulation, but they become really good at hiding it from the external world. And so it may come across that they're just functioning typically in society, but internally they're going through a lot. And I use that term because that's exactly what I felt like my whole life, is that internally I was going through so much, but from the outside, not many people could see that. And that's why I think when I started to become so open about my mental health, about mental illness, everyone's like, oh, like I would have never guessed that you had been going through this like your whole life. And I'm like, yeah, because I got really good at not showing that side of me.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that, Taylor.
Yeah.
And then I heard you say going through this for 28 plus years before receiving the diagnosis. So how did you come to that point to make a decision to look at getting a diagnosis?
It started, I was in university, in my first year of university, and my mental health had just dropped. Like I had tried to do what I did in high school, where I was just focusing my obsessions on school, but my program was so hard and challenging at the time that it was all consuming, and my mental health had just plummeted. But luckily I was taking this basic psychology course, like psychology 101 or something, whatever. at U of C, and I was reading the textbook and they were breaking down mental disorders, and I read the section on OCD, and I actually just like started bursting out, like crying.
Oh.
And I like ran upstairs to my mom and I was like, read this. Like, this is me. And like, I still choke up a little bit from it because it was literally the first time my entire life that I had felt seen. Like that part of me that like I'd been hiding for so long finally felt seen.
Wow.
And so like, but I wasn't ready to accept it at that time. Like I was like, okay, like that could be a thing like that I'll explore, but I'm just gonna kind of put that on the shelf for now.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went traveling with one of my friends that summer. So that would have been earlier in the year in that summer. And she started talking to me about like her family having some mental health challenges and going to therapy. And I want to mention that because that helped me kind of maybe be more open to therapy and realize like, maybe I don't have to like be ashamed of this and maybe like I can get help. And so I remember one day it was like raining. We were in Costa Rica and it was raining and I was sitting on a hammock and I suddenly just had like a moment where I just like called my mom and I was like, I need help. Like when I get home, can you please set up like an appointment with a counselor? My mom's like, yeah, absolutely. And so that's kind of where like the journey started towards recovery or getting support.
Wow. Incredible. Thank you for sharing that and being vulnerable.
Yeah.
And that piece of the story. Had you heard of OCD before that? Like, was that something you knew about before that diagnosis, just in general?
Yeah, I did. But same as kind of like, I think a lot of people is I just thought it was the cleaning and organizing.
Yeah.
And to me, that was never stressful. Like, I just like things clean. I like things organized. It doesn't cause me like this distress. Whereas the thoughts of like, what if I harm my parents? That was what was like causing me to like be so stressed and so anxious.
Yeah.
And so even like growing up, like the paranoid phase that I had mentioned, that wouldn't be like what I would consider to be OCD of what I knew about OCD at that time, right? And also what a lot of people like don't realize, like things like fears like that can be related to OCD, which kind of like leads also, because sometimes people will say like, oh, like I get anxious about things like that too. Like how do you know when it's an anxiety disorder or when it's like OCD? And from what my knowledge is that OCD has those two parts, right? That obsession, that fear, and that you do something, whether it be a repetitive thing or something in your head, like challenging a thought or checking your thoughts or doing mental rituals in order to feel better from the anxiety. Somebody with anxiety just has anxiety and they're not engaging in those compulsions to try to like relieve that anxiety.
Okay.
Which I think is important to kind of note there because that's also had caused me some confusion.
Yeah.
But yeah, coming into something I also want to state too is like, I know that some people are uncomfortable with labels and diagnosis. And I think sometimes our parents, even in our own practice, are scared of their kids having these labels. But I'll say like that moment I went to a psychiatrist and they confirmed like, oh yeah, you have your textbook OCD, was like day 2 of finally feeling seen.
Yeah.
It was like actually being able to like put a name to it was life-changing for me. And so that was like I think like those 2 defining moments of like reading that textbook and then getting like an actual diagnosis was like, oh my goodness, like now I can actually make progress and change because I know what I'm working with now.
Wow, so powerful. And you mentioned your mom a few times in your story. What role did she play in all this? It sounds like there was, and you can say as little or as much, but it sounds like in one way you had the support of her to be able to take some of these steps to get that diagnosis. And what did that, like, that would be, I know a lot of people don't necessarily have that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think there was kind of 2 sides of it. Like my mom is just like has been supportive since day 1. She didn't understand. They had no idea what I was going through. But she's like, whatever's in your best interest. And like at that point I was over 18. Yeah. So I was able to kind of make my own decisions anyways. But I also needed like that guidance and support. And she was always kind of on board of like, whatever you need, like, let's figure this out together.
That's awesome.
And I think like from my dad's side, my dad's a beautiful human. I think he struggled a little bit with understanding, like when I first came forward with it, like he was like, what does that mean? And don't we all have anxiety? Don't we all like what? I don't think he actually understood how good I was at masking it all those years. And so, and sometimes kids are just more open with one parent than the other. And that just happened to be my mom for me. And so my mom knew what all of those years, those masking, but my dad didn't. And so going through that journey, it kind of like, he had some difficulty at the starting acknowledging it, but now he's like my number one supporter. Like he'll be the first one to comment or like on something that I do of mental health. Like he gets it now and he can like see it. And this was during a time when like after my diagnosis, I decided that I was going to start online like health blog Instagram account for health. And so I started just like posting like fitness stuff and stuff. And then every now and again, I would see like a little like mental health matters post or something like that. And I found like people like really responded well.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, this was like a decade ago. So like it still wasn't really that talked about more than a decade ago. And so then people started to kind of like reach out and be like, oh, thanks for sharing that and stuff. So the more and more that kept happening, I was like, okay. And I kind of became more comfortable sharing mental health stuff to the point where at one point I had like 7,000 followers on this account that I'd created.
Yeah.
And a lot of them, and I had shut it down about half a decade ago just because it was causing more stress to post than it had at the start. But still to this day, so many people, whether acquaintances, strangers, friends, come up to me and they're like, you have made a difference in my life, or you've saved my life, all just because I've just been like open about my own story and my own journey. And I think that that's like why that's such a big characteristic of mine is just like, I'm just open about it because if I'm not, and if I'm contributing to us all like hiding mental illness in this box and just putting it away, then like there's going to be someone who's my age or who's like little me that's growing up with something that they're going to be ashamed of for many years. And not everyone does have the privilege of getting supports and getting help and having parents that like are like, yeah, we're in it, like whatever you need. Not many kids, or I shouldn't say not many kids, some kids don't have that availability. And so even if I can just get them more comfortable with being who they are, like then I've done my goal.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I think what's coming into my mind is just the power of vulnerability.
Yeah.
And speaking our truth and honoring who we are, because what we know is that when we create shame or have shame and we keep it inside, it festers and like it tears us down. And the moment we can have an opportunity or the ability or the hand to help lead us out and to express that vulnerability, it becomes our superpower. I mean, I think we see that from some of these most influential people, and you being one of them, like using your story and your vulnerability is your strength.
Yeah.
Right? And your strength in now creating hope, but acceptance and celebration.
Yes.
Even of like who you are and what you and this part of you that has OCD, right?
Yeah.
But like celebrating the two in a way and finding a way to make them work together and creating meaning. It's amazing, Taylor. Thank you.
Like if we can pivot to us now, because you mentioned all of that about creating hope or letting go of shame, and now I just like we can pivot to our practice, because I feel that the process of coming to us and working with us in the first place is usually like a lot of negativity, a lot of pain, a lot of shame for parents who are like, I've already gone through so many hoops of like going through this diagnosis and getting funding, and now I have to talk to more strangers about my child's life story, and now have more adults come into my house, which is probably like my most vulnerable sanctuary of all to work. But when I explain to people our coaching style and how we and our approach and how we frame and like, you know, how we define and take on disability, a lot of them will say, gosh, like this is what I want. this is, or well, like some parents will say, that's the first time I've ever heard somebody say that my son is awesome. Yeah.
Or that they're worth celebrating because of maybe the challenge they have. And I think what we mean by that is just like, like I go back to that word acceptance, like accepting people where they're at is like, I think the building block to be able to celebrate and overcome challenges. But if there's no acceptance, I feel like it's hard to even look at yourself, right? Or be willing to acknowledge that maybe there is something that's holding you back. And then you get to that breaking point. Some kids get to that break, or people get to that breaking point because they've been masking it for so long, and sometimes it's too late.
Oh, I could do a whole episode on masking.
Yeah.
Because I think about how maybe the only depictions of OCD that a person has had up to a certain point could have just been books, television, pop culture, where you mention like, oh, maybe it's just cleaning and organizing. And then sometimes those characters are like the butt of people's jokes, or it becomes a saying how everybody has blah, 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 or, oh, I'm so this. I'm so
OCD.
Yeah.
The whole using it as a trope versus like actually understanding what the actual struggle is and stuff like that. Because, you know, again, people, the whole concept of masking in itself, like, you know, we also just outwardly present it in a way that, you know, people who are more neurotypical will kind of digest it to kind of like leave us alone in our own little bubble.
Absolutely.
And then when you go outside that, it's like that's the whole thing of like, where they're like, why, how do you, you know, you present that like that way that they can't understand what you're struggling with because of the fact that you've already spent so much of your energy kind of adapting to them.
Yeah.
So,
and if I don't understand myself too, right? Like how do I expect anyone else to understand? And that's kind of where I go back to like how when I did read that first definition, I finally felt seen. I kind of like put that away because I'm like, that's a lot. That's overwhelming. I'm happy that I like can finally like put a name to it, but like I'm gonna just put that there. It's easier for me to just mask and just kind of carry on until I'd hit the point where I'm like, no, this isn't working for me. Like me kind of fitting in and hiding this part of myself is working for everybody else except for me. And I think that that's a lot of like what I kind of try to work with families, and just being like empathetic towards that is sometimes like families do need to just put it on the shelf for a little bit. And holding that space for them to be able to do that, and encouraging them to take back off the shelf when they're ready to open it again.
Oh, I love that.
Like it's a journey. It is like the acceptance isn't just like one day you wake up and you're like, yep, I have OCD, or yep, I have autism. Like acceptance is like a lifetime process. And even for me, like sometimes like I know OCD, I'll have OCD forever. And even the thought of like accepting that every day seems hard. And so like taking it one day at a time, and one day at a time. And sometimes you do have to put it on the shelf for a little bit. But just being willing to like open it back up, not keeping it up there.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And I love that idea that, yeah, it's a process. It's a journey. It's, you know, it's not something that needs to be tackled upon, but something that needs to be worked with.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think a lot of parents, it being, I'm not a parent myself yet, but like, I think there's a lot of fear around having a kid with a diagnosis. I think, like I mentioned, my dad, I know him, and he was just so scared of like what that means for me. Yeah. And I think like that's a lot of what I run into families. It's like, okay, like we accept it, but like, what does that mean for like outward? Like, how will they be treated? Will they be bullied all the time? Are they going to get a job? All of these different things that they kind of just rather this masking, because like the masking as a family, the situation, because it's like, there's so much fear over what does this actually mean for our family? So as Key Creative, I think all of us do like such a wonderful job of coming in and being like, oh no, we're accepting you for whatever you give us. Like you don't need to mask around us. If anything, I don't want you to mask around. Like I want us to like really connect on like core to core level of like who you are. And I think personally, like me coming from what I had gone through, I can be more patient with like families in that. And I've also gotten so good at just like celebrating like those successes, like whether they're like we got up this morning and I'm like, woohoo, let's like, that's a good day, because I was at a point where like even the thought of getting up in the morning was too much. And so I can kind of, I think, given my journey, like really be able to like find those successes.
Yeah.
And even like, I would love to talk about medication after this, because I think that that's also something that's highly stigmatized. But I had spent the last year going off my medication that I've been on for over a decade. And this is actually the first week that I've been off of it, which is huge for me, and like how much fear was behind and how attached I was to that medication.
Totally.
And not addicted, but attached in the sense of like, what would I be like without it? That like my husband are like, we'll go out and celebrate this, because it's something that's me outwardly, people are like, okay, she weaned off her medication, big deal. But like for me, I'm like, I celebrate like every part of this journey. Because looking back where I was 11 years ago or 12 years ago, like there's been just taking it one day at a time and one foot in front of the other.
Well, and I think it's just going back to that masking, like for so long you were masking it, right? So to now be able to celebrate something that was creating a lot of distress, or and I don't want to put words in your mouth in this way, but something that needed to maybe be seen, you are now seeing it and able to now celebrate it. I wanted to touch on the piece about the diagnosis and how that was actually like, you don't know if you use this word, but like liberating in a way, like it was a good thing for you. And so just talking about labels in that way, like that label giving you sort of a comfort. Could you speak about that a little bit more? And for other people who might be questioning, like, what does the label really matter? But why does it matter? Why did it matter to you, and how has it helped you?
I think what the label meant to me at that time was just like an answer for me, and just like, and then also a starting point. Because like I had mentioned, because I'd been masking my OCD for so many years and hadn't gotten treatment or anything, I was in a very, very, very low place. And it gave me like a starting point. And so given the diagnosis, I was able to be like, okay, like this, now I have a label. Now I know like I can go to an OCD specialist or like these medications. Like it helped me just like narrow down. Also a huge side of me is I'm a researcher. I love to research anything and everything about anything. Like, and so as soon as I got the OCD, and from reputable sources, I'm going to add, not just like a blog on because there's some questionable stuff out there. But as soon as I got that OCD diagnosis, I read every book that there was about OCD. Cause I was like, if I have this, I'm going to learn everything about it.
Wow. Yeah.
And it helps me kind of, again, externalize it and be like, that is a part of me. I think when we don't do diagnosis, and it's everyone's choice, absolutely. But when there aren't labels or diagnosis, I think sometimes people's identity can get lost in it.
Yeah.
And so, and what I mean by that is like, if I didn't get an OCD diagnosis, or if I was still undiagnosed and had no idea, I would just think that was me. Like,
well,
and
it sounds like
that's also the first time I'm hearing masking as a family, right? And it's like kind of falling into my head of times where I've been to see a family, and maybe a sibling they'll say, oh, she's taking a shower right now. I don't hear any running water at all. So actually, I think their oldest child is having like a sensory break away from me, but they've given me this story that, oh, she's taking a shower, to like normalize the behavior, or the behavior they want.
Well, we can't show that anything's wrong with us. Like, my kid can't be crying in front of anyone or having a tantrum.
Yeah.
You know, I even think of with my close friends sometimes, and I have let go of this, but just to normalize, like being like, oh my God, I don't want my kid to act out. But there's much more stuff now. And I just shared this post that said, your child misbehaving is not a sign. Oh gosh, can I pull it up? Can I pull it up? I want to pull it up. I'm going to pull it up. I shared it too, because it was just one of those, for me, I needed it as a reminder. And it was just powerful about just the way we view things with misbehavior and how we judge that as bad parenting versus that doesn't have to mean that it's bad parenting, right?
Well, I think like with Key, we always
If I don't
advocate
have-
that like behaviors are just, something that's, a detective sign for people to be able to figure out what's kind of going on. Like, where the difference between behaving and behaviors is so different. Like one's an expectation
Yeah.
and one's like a clue of someone kind of like letting themselves out there. And that's the thing with like labels. If you cut off labels and diagnoses as like part of it, you basically are cutting out one of the most like specific things, because yes, there are stigmas with labels. However, that's not who the entirety of the person is. It is a means of self-advocating. And the problem isn't with you for having that label. The problem is with someone else being like, well, I'm going to look at this as just being how something's perceived in media. I'm going to look at this as somehow the standard stigmas. And so being able to like actually self-advocate as an individual with that label is so much more important, because, going in and just saying, well, that's just Mike, what does that mean to someone else? Whereas you can say that's ADHD, that's their OCD, their ODD, different things that can come into play so that someone can kind of like understand that's not just the quirkiness, that's the individual. And then you can get to the point of talking about how do we support the individual?
Absolutely. That was beautifully worded. And I think when we are scared of labels, when we're scared of diagnosis, we're just reinforcing the stigma around mental illness, that like having a mental illness is something that we need to be ashamed of. I think if we can own our diagnosis and say like, yeah, I have OCD, like I'm pretty sure everyone in the world at this point knows I have OCD, because that's just a part of me and I have no shame towards that anymore. Because I felt if I had to hide it and if I was scared, and at one point I did not tell my friends, and I was very much not open about it. But then I was like, but then how do I expect other people to be open with it? How do I expect eventually 30 years from now for there not to be mental illness stigma if I'm so scared of like sharing my own journey?
Yeah. And now you're helping so many people because you are willing to share your story, right? And so that's the beauty of it, I see, right? And that's so powerful. I didn't find it, but I don't think it's just, it really is to that point that just because your child is well behaved doesn't mean you're a good parent necessarily, but more so like if your child's misbehaving, it doesn't mean you're a bad parent. We're supposed to like express ourselves and show emotion and all of these things. And I know that's different than what we're talking about, but just to the same point of like just honoring what is going on for us, and that is okay. It doesn't make us less than anyone. It just makes us who we are. And that is, we're celebrating.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think like at one point, like earlier on when I became an OT, I would get really sad when like families would be so ashamed of like the diagnosis. And almost like angry, like in my own experience of just being like, why can't you just like let them be themselves? But now I've kind of changed the script a little bit of it, and I see it as just like that fear, the fear of like, if they have this diagnosis, it's not like families, and in some cases it might be as like, we'll look bad. A lot of it I think is like, what does that mean for our kid if they have this diagnosis? Like how will they be treated by society? Because people who are different are often, or people who are neurodiverse are often treated as lesser in society. So I think any parent wants to have a healthy child, and whether that be mentally, physically, all of the above. And so the fear, it comes from like, what does that actually mean? And so now that I've kind of changed that, and when I do find families that there's that huge masking as a family, we started a new
Yeah,
thing,
because we did.
masking as a family. But when I do see that, I'm kind of like, where's the fear here? Like, what is the fear? Is the fear like that you're worried your kid can't get a job or that they won't finish university? Like, and I try to kind of like incorporate the child's strengths like through that a lot more, and like highlight the family that yes, they have this, but they also are like incredible with numbers. Like they probably will be the next Einstein because like they can like do mathematic problems like all day, every day, and they love it and they're incredible at it. And so I try to kind of change the script a little bit for those families and be like, okay, let's actually focus on what's going to make your child wonderful and awesome, and less about like where like maybe the barriers are in, for their journey.
I think of that also just like the perception, like giving a different perception or view on how they can, what they can focus on
Yes.
in that way. And sometimes it's just a small shift, like just focusing on what is going well versus what's not.
Yes.
Right.
And even like for behaviors and regulation, because we were talking about that earlier, is like a kid who's always experiencing episodes of dysregulation or feeling out of control. And I often tell like parents like at this age, I'm like, that's a good thing. Like, because you're here, you get to like help them and walk them through the process of re-regulating, of learning the behaviors, like learning about behaviors. What a beautiful opportunity when they're this age to be able to do that, so that when they get to university or when they get to whatever comes after they leave your house, they have these skills in their toolbox. Their nervous system knows how to calm down. So like even changing that framing to that this dysregulation doesn't need to be considered like a bad thing for a kid.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to my point, if I can go off on it a little bit again, is that we need to experience all of our emotions. Like we need to experience anger. We need to experience sadness. We need to experience happiness. And when we start to create a block from experiencing emotion, then it starts to get stuck inside, and then it starts to can also create illness or whatever, because we haven't given it space to live like it needs to, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why me too, like with my children, I'm always like, feel the sadness. And sometimes it's hard, and I'm not always perfect with that, but I remind myself that it's healthy. It doesn't mean I'm a bad parent. Doesn't mean I've done something wrong. I'm actually maybe doing something right because I've created them space to feel that. And they are supposed to have tantrums. Like, they don't learn if they don't have tantrums.
Exactly.
Right.
Like,
and then remember, just a reminder, don't compare yourself to other parents.
No. Exactly.
Don't compare your kids to other kids.
No, we're all
because
on
we
our
also
own journey.
have like, if they don't have OCD, it means they're more on track. Like they're more accepted. They'll be more celebrated. Or that kid's doesn't have any tantrums. They're much more well-behaved. They're doing way better. Their parents are way more on track, right? Like we have these narratives about these things, which then that don't serve us.
Exactly.
Yeah. Like I think to like what you were kind of saying about like the whole idea of how it was like very liberating for yourself once you had the label and stuff like that. But like for families where that barrier can be is, similar to like someone who undergoes, like that's something that's been a part of you your entire life. So like the liberating thing is having that label and that idea of something that you can like self-advocate, something you can compartmentalize to kind of say, this isn't me. But for like families where they kind of like similar to someone who gets a new disability, have to mourn that loss of function in that sense. And so like they go through that whole process, and there's that shame in those different things. And they don't realize that the biggest thing that's going on there is there being a barrier to like the care of their child, or like kind of getting to that point where the person can get to those supports or really feel comfortable because, family masking is going on, that they can't really, self-advocate to a point of like, this is me and this is what I need to thrive, to succeed.
Yes. That's a beautiful point, Mike, because I also going into families like, and they have access to specialized services, and they only have access for like usually like a certain amount of years. And sometimes when some of these families are in that mourning period, I think that's exactly what they're, that grief, right? Of like losing what you thought, or even what you thought your child would be like, right? It makes services so much harder when there's that barrier, and it's unfortunate, but like also I've really like come to terms of just like meeting a family where they are at. And if we're at the grieving stage, I will hold your guys' hands through that stage, hoping that we can kind of speed up that grief so that we can now actually look at like supports and helping the child.
Yeah. Because like with the child, like, they're going to, once they kind of are able to self-actualize, if that's in their capacity, it'll be that liberating thing for them. Right. And then also having an environment where they feel seen and feel able to take the mask off is so much better to thrive and be able to use those other strategies that kind of let them kind of succeed on their own terms.
Absolutely. I think the sooner we can kind of accept to that and come to that realization in a family dynamic that, someone needs extra supports. Like if we would have discovered this when I was young, I would have needed extra supports. The sooner we can kind of come to that realization, the more there will be less shame for the child, and B, there will be more access to that help.
For those, let's say maybe even children, adolescents, or adults who are maybe don't have access to the supports, but are resonating with the message and the understanding of OCD and maybe can relate, what advice or strategies could you or would you share with them?
I would say, I know for our Canadian healthcare system in particular, I know it's different other places, but we do all have access to that family doctor, or even a walk-in clinic. And so starting with the mental health, a healthcare professional is important.
Yeah.
And I can't kind of give advice without saying that first, is that you should be trying to work with a healthcare professional. But as you said, if it's kind of they don't have access to this, the OT part of me goes back, just focus on the basics, focus on just taking care of you as a human being, drinking enough water, getting enough sleep, fueling yourself with nutritious food, moving your body, taking care of those basic needs, because if those aren't taken care of and those are rocky, everything else that's on top of it, whether our mental abilities are going to be rocky as well. And so sometimes if we can't do these therapies and things like that are out there, and nowadays it's pretty wonderful because they have apps I think Duolingo just created an app that does anger.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're
Emotional
kind of
languages.
they're doing, instead of in addition to languages now, where the kids can or people can do mental health stuff.
Okay.
So there are so much stuff out there, but making sure that you don't get caught into all of the misinformation that's out there. Especially when it comes to people with OCD. I think people with OCD like to know things. And the reason behind that is the lack of uncertainty is very scary for somebody with OCD. And so they'll do a lot of research into something, which can also be detrimental if it's not the right reputable sources. And what I mean by that is published scientific journals, talking to an actual physician and stuff. Those are going to be more than finding somebody on a blog. Finding a community online is beneficial in a different sense of not feeling like you're alone.
And are there communities out there like that?
I couldn't speak to it, but I would assume so.
Yeah.
Just on what I know about some of the other communities for ADHD and autism and stuff. I would assume so, but I can't speak to what they would be. Which are beautiful. If you can have access to a community of people, that's life-changing, because there's people who actually know what you're going through, and how I said before, being felt seen. But that's not always accessible to everybody, and I'm aware of that. And so coming back and working on those basic needs as a foundation. And then hopefully, if that's your foundation's strong, then everything else kind of will seem more manageable. My biggest advice that I still say to clients all the time is just taking it one day at a time. And sometimes it's 1 second at a time. And sometimes you can't get out of bed, but you're going to move just a minuscule amount just to make sure you've done something for the day, but just keep moving forward. And some days you may move back a couple steps, but then move forward a little bit more the next day. But if you're moving forward, then eventually you'll look back, I have 12 years later, and I'm compared to where I was to where I'm now, it's night and day. Yeah, that's what I would.
I think that piece about making sure that, you so that you do feel that support and stuff like that, finding a community is important. And again, definitely make sure those resources are important, because especially when you're dealing with those the compulsion or just even whatever element of your diagnosis, you do fall down that rabbit hole, and the confirmation bias is incredible. And for the multitude of challenges that I have, I've seen so many things, especially in the influencer realm, where like there are definitely those influencers who go with the published works and stuff like that. But then there are all the other ones who like, thinking about a traumatic thing that's been going on right now and that presents, and you as a trauma specialist, trauma can present quite a bit like ADHD, and all the ADHD influencers that have just popped up through the pandemic. And it's like, well, we've gone through this big traumatic,
that's a whole
other episode.
I would recommend
you
can listen to some Gabor Mate, and he has different, well, he has a very strong research-based perspective on some of those things, which are interesting. And I think that can be another conversation, but
people, they seek out all these things, and you have the confirmation of bias there, but they're describing things that are not those things. And while a diagnosis or a label isn't a one size fits all thing, but there are things where it's like, yes, no, this might be this and this might be that. And, seeking out, a health professional and even with that, like another thing that I would say, especially with that, is seek out a health professional that does support you there, because there's a lot of doctors who will kind of try to do everything.
Well,
and you might need to find one that can support you where you're at and find there, because you need someone who can refer to get those specialized diagnoses.
Yes. And get second opinions.
Yes.
Like I can't even tell you how many therapists I've had over the years. And that's like a big thing, is like a lot of people that I've come in contact that have reached out to me, and bringing it back to like medication as well, is they will say things like, I've tried a medication and it doesn't work, or I've tried a therapy and it's just not for me. And I'm like, you're not going to try. I've tried 4 medications before I found the one that I had been on for the last decade. Therapists, I can't even count on my hand how many therapists I've seen over the years, because sometimes you find a therapist and you click. Sometimes you don't click. Sometimes you click for a period and then you don't click anymore and you need to move on to another therapist to teach you other skills. Like, it's not a one size fits all for any mental health conditions. And I think that is a beautiful thing to know, Mike, because my experience in the healthcare world for when I got diagnosed, like, I'm lucky I'm a good advocate for myself, because I would have definitely just been pushed to the side. I remember when I first got diagnosed, they were like, oh, anxiety and depression, which like probably, but because I had OCD, like as my primary, those things just trickled in. Right. And until I advocated and said, I want a psychiatrist referral. Psychiatrists are doctors that are specialized in mental health, particularly, like this is their jam. This is what they do. I want to talk to a specialist, and then I want a diagnosis. And sure enough, I got a referral. Like, it's easier than I think some families realize, if you advocate for it from a doctor, to get a psychiatry referral. And it just allowed me to, again, have another perspective. And that's who gave me my formal diagnosis, which was very important for me, that it came from somebody who was well known and in terms of like his knowledge for that stuff. But yes, some people will be pushed to the side in their community if they do not advocate for themselves. And I tell families that all the time: advocate for yourself, advocate for your child. If you don't feel like this diagnosis really describes them, ask for a second opinion. Like, ask for the assessment. Ask, like, really, if you advocate for themselves or for yourself, like, you can't go wrong, because that's when you're being provided with like the most knowledge and the most like backing of about your child.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Any final comments, questions?
Well, for me, I hope this episode helps listeners and watchers feel seen, because I think so many in our grown-up professional world, especially healthcare industry too, there's a lot of professionals, a lot of adults who don't disclose any sort of diagnoses or any sort of accommodations when they are onboarding to new jobs all the time. And like, my older brother is a psychiatrist, so he's like, oh my gosh, like I can he sees it all the time, like ding 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 all the different folks that do so. But just like, I've had different family ex-partners who they disclose something, and then the other coworkers or management that they're with laugh at it, reject it, use it as a point against them to be dismissed from that job eventually. So whereas here we are at Key Creative, and many of us sitting here in this room are open about it. It's an asset to us. It's a perspective that we are now able to help others climb that ladder together.
Yeah.
And I think that makes all the difference. In the back of my head, there's another episode about like medical and social models of disability, where I think in an archaic approach to disabilities and recovery, that masking is like like what would have been an objective in the past of like, okay, well, you can blend in with the neurotypicals, you're cured. Yeah. You've adapted.
Yeah.
This is managed
You've done
now.
well.
When really,
You've
I'm
done
like,
well. When really, you're
this is taking
inside.
so much of your mental bandwidth every day that it doesn't surprise me when people unmask that they get like exhausted and maybe they'll sleep for days, or they get really angry and agitated because this is the first time you're actually letting like your limbic system go this way, or that you can do that, or I don't know, you're doing yoga and then you start crying on the mat. I'm like, yes, I'm so glad you did that because you finally had the chance.
Yeah.
And I think I think that's important to note too, because masking also, like this is a trigger warning for listeners, but there's a study that was done in Sweden, and they determined that people with OCD are 10 times more likely to suicide than individuals without OCD. And a lot of that is what I perceive to be a misunderstanding from society, as we've talked about, and feeling like this need to mask. And when you bottle stuff up, like at one point, you're going to explode, like if you have no outlet for that. So I think that that's important to say. And it helps OCD to be taken a little bit more seriously, that it's not just this like, oh, I'm so OCD, which we should not be saying in society, because it makes OCD seem like this cute characteristic. Oh, she's so OCD. She likes to line up things. It's not taken seriously, where it needs to be taken absolutely seriously, even just based on that one study showing how impactful it can be on somebody's life.
Thank you for sharing that, Taylor. Amazing. Thank you for this conversation, for sharing your story, for sharing your awesomeness. It wouldn't be a Key Talks if I didn't say your amazing, surprising, beautiful, powerful self. Mental health matters, and I'm so proud to be able to share these conversations, but just be part of the conversations. And be here with you today. So thank you.
I just want to share one thing before we wrap up. I used to always say, like when I was going through this journey, that there would be a ton of stuff that I would trade to not have OCD. I used to like joke that I would chop off my left arm if it meant I didn't have to have OCD anymore. But I don't feel like that anymore. I feel like OCD has helped me that OCD in the past 30 years has taught me more about myself than I think some people go a lifetime with knowing. It's helped me become more empathetic and patient with people. It's taught me so much that I couldn't picture my life without having OCD too. And so I think also, but I'm also in a state where I can look back and reflect on that. So my advice for anyone who is really struggling and really is just take one step at a time, and also look at like what you're learning about yourself. And because some people go like a whole lifetime without getting that chance to really dive into all the corners of who you are.
And let's all like just take a moment to love ourselves and tell ourselves that we love ourselves for all that we are. The perfections, more so the imperfections, because it all makes us valuable, important, worthy, purposeful people. We all have a role to play in this world. And so I always just like, how can we love ourselves just a little bit more?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thanks, Taylor.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's whoosh it out.
I still wait. Can you do it again?
The whoosh handshakes. We got our fists. The fists are out to start, right? And then they go back towards us like French fries, fingers out, and then fist back in.
Okay.
And then we also do the sound effect, right? The wind tunnel. Yeah.
You knock over the water.
I'll try. I gotta go my microphone. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Whoosh.
we gotta redo it. We gotta do it.
Okay. One more. Whoosh.
I'm terrible at it. I cannot coordinate it in my brain.
Potatoes, fries, potatoes.
Oh, that's a good one. Potato fries. Okay.
Key Talks is a project of Key Creative. The views expressed in this podcast represent the opinions of their speakers and do not constitute medical advice. If you have questions or concerns about your own mental health or disabilities, please reach out to professional help in your community. Our co-hosts are Paula Audrey Rivero and Deanna Halls. Our production team is Michael Schweik, Jessa Dupuis, and Deanna Halls. Music by John Rivero. To reach out to us or access services for you or your family, visit keycreative.com. That's QICreative.com and fill out our online intake form. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.